The splintered oak wheel of the buckboard wagon gave way with a sickening crack, pitching 22-year-old Abigail Vance sideways into the sharp red dirt of a dry gulch. The panicked mule kicked wildly in its harness, spraying gravel as a rattle from the sagebrush signaled an angry diamondback taking strike position just inches from Abby's pinned ankle. Dust choked her throat, and her bruised shoulder throbbed where it had absorbed the brunt of the impact. The vast, empty horizon of North Texas stretched around her like an open furnace, no water, no passerby, and a sun dropping fast behind the jagged teeth of Rattlesnake Ridge. In the silence of the wilderness, survival wasn't a promise. It was a daily negotiation. Slowly, deliberately keeping her heavy breath tucked deep within her chest, Abby reached down and hauled her round, dust-caked frame upward with the fierce, unyielding strength hidden beneath her soft exterior. She grabbed a heavy cedar fence post lying nearby and jammed it between the rattlesnake and her boot, driving the reptile back into the brush before it could strike. She didn't scream, and she didn't weep. Life had already stripped her of the luxury of panic. It was October 1888, and the Texas Panhandle air carried the dry iron smell of pending frost. Abby was not the kind of woman folks in town wrote poems about. She was heavy-set, broad-shouldered, and carried herself with the hesitant, slouched posture of someone who had spent her youth being told she took up entirely too much room. But beneath that quiet, timid shell lay a resilient, stubborn endurance. 6 months earlier, a sudden, merciless tornado had torn through her family's home on the outskirts of St. Louis, burying her mother and father under the splintered ruins of their timber barn. Abby had survived only because she had been down in the storm cellar pulling up jars of preserved peaches. When the wind stopped roaring, she was left with nothing but an aching emptiness in her chest, a trunk of hand-me-down dresses and a piece of stiff yellowed leather handed to her by her father's probate attorney. It was her grandfather's will, drafted in 1865, bequeathing 80 acres of rocky, lime-heavy Texas pasture and a sagging white house to whomever among my blood possesses the silence to listen to what the ground is trying to say. Her older brother had laughed, declaring the land a dust trap, and remained in St. Louis to work the rail yards. Abby, possessing nowhere else to go and carrying a grief too heavy for city streets, packed her canvas bag, boarded a westbound train, and rode the final 40 miles into the rugged expanse of Oak Haven. The town of Oak Haven was not welcoming to a lonely, overweight city girl. The local shopkeepers watched her shuffle into the feed store in her oversized wool coat and worn boots, whispering behind their hands. The Old West was built by lean, leather-skinned men and sharp-featured pioneer women. Abby looked like a soft loaf of bread dropped into a briar patch. Her only living kin on the property was her great-aunt Merle. At 79, Aunt Merle was the polar opposite of Abby, thin as a willow whip, her skin cured like saddle leather from 7 decades of Texas sun. Merle wore a pair of her late brother's canvas trousers, rubber boots, and a heavy Colt revolver strapped low on her hip. She lived in a 2-room log cabin on the far corner of the ridge. When Abby arrived, Merle offered no tearful embrace. She simply handed Abby an iron skillet pointed to the brass pump handle in the yard and said, "The well is 90 feet deep. The water is sweet, but you'll have to earn every single gallon." The morning of the autumn livestock auction at the county fairgrounds, a bitter wind cut through the timber barns. Abby stood near the back rail of the auction ring, her hands shoved deep into her coat pockets to hide their nervous trembling. The pens were packed with lean steers, wire-haired goats, and half-wild horses, but back behind the main barn, stacked 5 high in rusted wire crates, sat 50 battered, dying beehives. They were a tragic sight. The wooden boxes were split and weather-rotted, their frames encrusted with diseased comb and thick with dust. Inside, the weakened bees crawled aimlessly across the wire mesh, their wings tattered and their low, distressed hum sounding like a collective sigh of exhaustion. A commercial apiary from the east had dumped them off at cost rather than deal with the infestation. The auctioneer cleared his throat, eager to move past the lot. "Got 50 commercial hives here, folks. Do I hear $1 a hive, 50 cents?" The crowd stood silent. Leaning against the wooden railing was Clayton Carver, the wealthiest cattle rancher in the valley. A tall, booming man with silver spurs and a mustache that hid his thin lips. Clayton spat a stream of black tobacco juice into the dirt and laughed aloud. "Only thing those pathetic boxes are good for is kindling to heat a pot of coffee," Clayton called out, his voice echoing across the barn. "They're finished. Those bees will be dead before the first snow hits the ridge." The men around him chuckled the easy, cruel laugh of people accustomed to agreeing with a powerful man. The auctioneer sighed, preparing to write the lot off as a total loss. "Flat price for the lot, then $10 for us." Abby looked at those boxes. Through the wire mesh, she saw the tiny creatures moving feebly, desperately clinging to one another in the chilling wind. She saw the way they huddled together, broken, discarded, and written off by a world that valued only what was young, sleek, and immediately profitable. A sharp ache rose in her throat, a sudden, overwhelming recognition. "They are like me," she thought, "left behind." Before her fear could stop her, Abby raised one thick, gloved finger. $15? Her voice quavered. It wasn't loud, but it carried clearly across the quiet morning air. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Sold to the young lady in the back for $15. Clayton Carver turned his cold gray eyes sweeping over Abby's round figure and ill-fitting coat. He shook his head with a sneer. "Well, plain as weather," he said loud enough for half the town to hear. "That heavy girl just paid $15 for the privilege of hauling 50 boxes of firewood up to Rattlesnake Ridge." The crowd erupted in laughter. Abby didn't say a word. Her face burned hot, but she kept her eyes fixed straight ahead. She walked past Clayton, her chin held high, and began hauling the heavy buzzing crates toward her rented buckboard wagon, listening to the fragile, desperate hum of the 50 colonies she had just claimed. She knew the hard work was only beginning, and as dark clouds gathered over the western hills, she knew the land and the brutal weather ahead would soon demand far more than $15 from her soul. The 3-mile journey from the fairgrounds back to the homestead was a slow, agonizing crawl through the dust. The rented wagon groaned under the weight of 50 battered, buzzing beehives, each jolt of the iron-rimmed wheels sending a ripple of agitated humming through the cracked wooden boxes. Abby kept her hands firm on the reins, her mind racing against the setting sun. She knew that bringing these exhausted, disease-ridden colonies to Rattlesnake Ridge was only the first half of a fool's gamble. The real trial lay in keeping them alive long enough for the harsh Texas soil to accept them, a truth made painfully clear the moment she pulled into the yard and found Aunt Merle waiting by the chestnut barn. The old woman spat into the dry grass, eyed the stacked wooden hives without a word, and tossed a small leather notebook onto the wagon seat before walking away. On its faded pages, written in her grandfather's hurried hand from 1865, was a single underline: "A sick hive is not dead. She is merely poisoned by poor pasture. Wash the comb with wild sage tea, feed the gut with boiled sugar syrup, and warm the brood with pine rosin." By morning, 6 hives had gone completely silent, their tiny inhabitants lying stiff on the cold wooden floorboards in the morning frost. Abby burned the infected wood near the dry gulch with a heavy heart, her back aching and her thick hands blistered from carrying the heavy boxes. The town's laughter echoed in her memory, but she forced herself to focus on the 44 colonies that remained. Following her grandfather's notes like a sacred order, she set to work. She hauled 40-gallon barrels of water from the deep well, her wide shoulders straining against the iron buckets until her breath came in ragged gasps. She brewed massive iron pots of wild sage tea mixed with crushed marigold stems and raw sugar over an open fire behind the barn. When she gently pried open the wooden lids to treat the comb, the weak bees crawled onto her thick gloves, blinking in the autumn sunlight. She didn't flinch when a few desperate bees stung her wrists. She worked with slow, rhythmic patience, whispering softly to the buzzing swarm. By the end of the 3rd week, the curve in her grandfather's ledger began to recreate itself. The surviving colonies cleansed their brood chambers, and thousands of newly hatched worker bees began streaming out of the hive entrances into the afternoon sky. They forage across the rocky slope of Rattlesnake Ridge, gathering nectar from late-blooming elderberry bushes and wild clover. More than the sudden burst of activity, the transformation in the honey itself left Abby breathless. When she carefully scraped a comb with her paring knife, the honey that flowed out was not pale and watery like factory syrup, but a deep glowing amber, thick as velvet, scented with wild herbs and rich with limestone minerals. Merle dipped a wooden spoon into the amber nectar during Sunday breakfast, swallowed in silence, and murmured that that was the very honey her brother used to harvest 20 years ago. With the first batch of amber honey bottled in heavy glass jars, Abby packed 2 crates into the wagon and drove into Oakhaven, pulling up behind the town's main boarding house and saloon. Joelle Pickard, the sharp-tongued proprietor, unscrewed one of Abby's jars on the kitchen counter. She lifted a spoonful, marveled at the rich amber glow. tasted it, and looked up at Abby with a keen, calculating eye. Right there on the spot, Joelle offered $6 a case, nearly triple the price of the flat diluted syrup shipped in by rail, demanding every single jar Abby could produce for her morning biscuit breakfasts. The transaction felt like a silent victory, but it didn't go unnoticed. At the feed store later that afternoon, Clayton Carver stood by the grain sacks, his tall frame blocking the doorway as he scoffed loud enough for the clerks to hear that a few jars of thick honey from dying boxes were nothing more than a temporary fluke before the frost wiped the bugs out completely. Abby held her tongue, carried her bag of raw sugar past him, and drove home knowing that argument was useless. The bees would have to deliver her answer. The true test of Abby's resolve arrived in late November when the horizon turned a bruised, unnatural purple. A sudden blue norther hit the panhandle, dragging a monstrous dust storm, a black roller across the open plain. The wind howled through the gulches like a wounded animal tearing shingles from the roof and driving choking red silt through every seam of the house. While the rest of the county locked their shutters and hid indoors, Abby ran out into the roaring gale. The storm whipped her heavy coat around her legs, blinding her with dust as the wind threatened to blow the wooden hives off their limestone bases. The panicked bees were trapped inside their fragile shelters on the verge of collapsing under the fury of the gale. Abby threw her heavy body into the raging wind, ignoring the stinging sand that tore at her face and the deep bruises forming on her knees as she scrambled across the rocks. She hauled heavy cedar logs and limestone boulders onto the lids of the hives, using her broad frame as a human shield to block the freezing dust from choking the entrance slots. She wrapped her own wool blankets around the most vulnerable boxes, securing them with thick hemp rope. Hour after agonizing hour, she stumbled back and forth through the darkness, her lungs burning with dirt and her strength nearly depleted. She refused to lose a single colony she had fought so hard to reclaim. When the storm finally spent its rage at dawn, leaving the valley buried under a blanket of red dust, Abby lay collapsed in the high grass, bleeding and bruised, surrounded by the deep, steady hum of 44 safe and warm hives. As she lay in the dust, watching the early sun turn the ridge to gold, she felt a profound change settling deep within her chest. She was no longer just a grieving city girl hiding from her past. She was taking root in this unforgiving soil, bound to the land by blood, sweat, and a quiet resilience that no storm could break. December arrived with a cruel, unrelenting frost that locked the Texas panhandle under a sheet of iron ice. The bitter temperatures froze the creek solid, dragging a harsh drought in their wake that crippled the entire valley. Deep mountain snowdrifts blocked the supply trains from the east, leaving Oak Haven completely isolated and cut off from basic medical goods and refined sugar. To make matters worse, a severe outbreak of winter croup and respiratory flu swept through the region, filling the town hospital, mining camps, and boarding houses with coughing elders and feverish children. Clayton Carver's massive cattle operation and commercial farm suffered heavily under the freeze. His imported livestock sickened, and his vast stores of grain sat frozen and inaccessible. The arrogance that had dominated the feed store discussions all autumn evaporated into quiet desperation as the town ran dangerously low on food warmth and remedies. Yet up on Rattlesnake Ridge, the 44 beehives Abby had saved from the auction thrived against all odds. The ancient wooden shelters built by her grandfather in 1862 from thick locust posts and chestnut planks held the earth's natural warmth, just as Aunt Merle had promised. Every morning at dawn, Abby hauled hot water and heated granite stones from the kitchen stove to insulate the bases of the hives, her broad shoulders swinging with heavy iron buckets through the drifts. Following her grandfather's herbal notes, she fed the colonies a rich, warm syrup infused with raw propolis, pine rosin, and dried wild sage. The bees remained cozy inside their insulated brood chambers, maintaining a steady, vibrant warmth. While the rest of the county suffered in barren silence, Abby's apiary possessed gallons of deep amber honey, a rich dark nectar packed with natural enzymes, wild herbal remedies, and concentrated limestone minerals. The turning point came on a freezing Tuesday morning when a lone horseman creaked up the snow-covered trail toward the Vance homestead. It was Clayton Carver. His fine leather coat was dusted with frost, his lips blue from the wind, and his proud posture slouched under the weight of sudden ruin. He dismounted heavily by the chestnut barn, standing near the porch where Abby was mending a wooden hive lid. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the sharp whistle of the winter wind against the ridge. Clayton stared at his boots for a long moment, his former arrogance completely stripped away, before reaching into his coat to pull out a heavy canvas purse filled with silver coin. In a quiet, raspy voice, he explained that his 8-year-old grandson was dangerously ill with severe croup. The hospital had run out of medicine, and the doctor had urged him to find raw honey and propolis to soothe the boy's chest. He offered a small fortune for 3 jars, admitting with a heavy bow of his head that his judgment had been utterly wrong. Abby looked at the money, then at the broken man standing in the snow before her. Memory brought back the echo of his cruel laughter at the auction ring when he had mocked her weight and predicted she was merely buying $15 worth of firewood. A dark impulse whispered in her mind to turn him away, to let him taste the bitterness of his own harsh words. But as she looked across the frozen pasture toward the oak tree where her grandfather rested, she remembered the core philosophy written in those brown cloth-bound ledgers. The ground does not hold grudges, and those who work it must be larger than their anger. She refused his offer of double payment, insisting instead on charging her standard price. She packed 4 jars of thick amber honey, along with a small cake of medicinal propolis salve, carefully explaining how to mix it with hot elderberry tea. Clayton stared at her in stunned silence, a deep flush of shame rising on his weathered neck as he accepted the remedies, offering a choked word of gratitude before riding back down the ridge. Within 2 weeks, Clayton's grandson recovered, and news of the miraculous amber nectar spread like wildfire through the frozen valley. Townspeople, miners, and doctors traveled up the icy trail to Rattlesnake Ridge to trade wool flour and tools for Abby's golden jars. Her grandfather's ledger notes were proving truer than ever. A hive raised on native wild flora possessed a restorative power that no factory chemical could ever replicate. Abby's honey did not merely soothe throats. It brought hope and healing to a town that had once rejected her. As winter slowly yielded to the tender green of an early April thaw, a quiet, inevitable sorrow settled over the homestead. Aunt Merle was slowing down. The 79-year-old woman no longer walked up to the upper pastures, preferring to sit on the sunlit porch with her old Colt revolver resting in her lap, watching Abby work with a peaceful, silent approval. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in fiery shades of red and gold, Merle looked at Abby and murmured that the farm had finally found the person it had been waiting for, someone who possessed the patience to listen to what the land required. 3 days later, Merle passed away peacefully in her sleep inside her 2-room log cabin. Abby buried her great-aunt on the high ridge beside her grandfather, standing alone in the spring breeze long after the small group of townspeople had departed. Her grief, quiet and deep, expressed not through loud weeping, but through her commitment to keep the daily work going. While sorting through Merle's belongings the following week, Abby discovered a small cedar box tucked under the floorboards of the cabin. Inside lay a single sheet of lined paper written in Merle's slanted hand, dated months before her death. Reading the faded ink, Abby's heart stopped. Merle revealed that in 1878, when a devastating drought had forced Abby's grandfather to sell off his land, a dishonest trader had stolen his prized hand-bred line of wild Texas honeybees, a unique strain bred over 20 years for their thick propolis and deep amber nectar. When Merle had looked into those battered wooden boxes behind the auction barn the previous October, she had recognized the distinct dark striping and gentle temperament of the worker bees immediately. The 50 dying hives Abby had bought for $15 were the direct descendants of her grandfather's lost colonies. The gamble had not been a random stroke of luck. It was the closing of a 40-year family circle, brought home by a grieving girl who had been guided by instinct and love. Holding the letter to her chest, Abby walked up to the upper field where thousands of honeybees were happily foraging among the newly blooming bluebonnets and elderberry bushes. The colonies were strong, their wooden boxes repaired and glowing in the spring sun, their daily yield sought after by the entire valley. Looking out over the vast Texas landscape, Abby realized that her time of surviving was over. She had taken root in this unforgiving soil, just as her grandfather had. Yet as she watched the swarm rise into the golden air, she knew that the future would bring new choices about growth scale and legacy, and that the true measure of what she had built would soon be tested as the years stretched on. 4 years had swept across the panhandle since the damp October morning when an overweight, grieving city girl had raised one trembling finger at the fairgrounds auction. By the autumn of 1892, the Vance homestead on Rattlesnake Ridge had evolved from a forgotten ruin into a quiet legend across the Texas frontier. The apiary now stood at exactly 100 thriving hives, a number Abby had settled upon after long careful reflection in her leather journals. She had refused every offer to expand onto Clayton Carver's fertile river-bottom lands, understanding with profound clarity that 100 colonies was the precise limit one person could care for without losing the intimate daily attention that gave her amber honey its unmatched restorative quality. Her rule remained written on the first page of her notebook: slow is the product. The transformation of the farm was mirrored in Abby herself. She was still a broad-shouldered, heavy-set woman, but the timid slouch born of city shame had vanished entirely. Her skin was cured to a warm golden brown by 4 seasons of Texas sun. Her hands were calloused and capable, and she moved across the steep limestone pastures with a calm, effortless grace. The townspeople of Oak Haven no longer looked at her with pity or suppressed amusement. When her buckboard wagon rolled down Main Street, shopkeepers and ranchers alike tipped their hats with genuine warmth, recognizing in her the very spirit of endurance that built the West. Caleb Pruitt, the young boy who had helped her load those rusted wire-strapped boxes on her first day in town, was now 20 years old and employed part-time at the homestead. Under Abby's quiet mentorship, Caleb had learned to read the Sky Mix herbal syrups and handle the swarms without fear. When he married his high school sweetheart that past spring, Abby had presented him with 3 prime healthy hives and a hand-built smoker as a wedding gift, ensuring that the legacy of patient stewardship would take root in another young family down the valley. Clayton Carver had become a frequent visitor to the ridge, stopping his horse by the upper barn 2 or 3 times a year to share a cup of black coffee on the porch. The old rancher had long abandoned his skepticism, often marveling at how the land and the bees had responded to her care. Though he still occasionally teased her about expanding her pastures, it was done now with the gentle affection of an elder brother. The amber honey from Rattlesnake Ridge was featured on the menus of premier hotels in Dallas and specialty apothecary shops as far away as New Orleans, praised in agricultural journals as the finest in the Southwest, an honor Abby found mildly amusing, though she never bothered to put up a sign at her driveway. The original 50 hives, the desperate dying colonies she had brought home for $15, had mostly lived out their natural cycles, their weathered wooden boxes replaced one by one with sturdy chestnut hives crafted by Abby's own hands. Only one queen remained from that first generation, an exceptionally resilient dark-striped queen she called Queen Mother, who had led her colony through dust storms, freezes, and droughts without fail. On a crisp, clear morning in mid-October 1892, the air carried the familiar dry smell of incoming frost, the exact same atmosphere as the morning her journey had begun. Abby stood at the fence of the upper field with a hot mug of coffee resting in her hands, watching thousands of worker bees return from the late-blooming elderberry bushes. They were the direct descendants of her grandfather's lost lineage, raised on the same rotated pasture, fed the same herbal syrups, and watered from the deep limestone well. Under the shade of the large elderberry bush, Queen Mother moved slowly across a sunny wooden landing board, her movements unhurried as her life drew to its natural close. Abby watched her for a long time, feeling a quiet ache-like gratitude settle deep within her chest. She knew the old queen would not survive the coming winter, but there was no sorrow in the thought, only the peaceful completion of a natural cycle. Abby walked slowly down the slope to the White House. The porch steps no longer creaked under her weight fixed years ago during her first winter. Inside the sunlit kitchen, she sat down at the heavy oak table where her grandfather had sat decades before. She opened the cloth-bound ledger, dipped her pen into the black ink, and wrote in her even, steady hand, October 14th, 1892. 100 hives thriving. Weather clear and crisp, stock healthy, the ground is resting well. She set the pen down, folded Aunt Merle's letter alongside her grandfather's 1865 leather will, and placed them neatly inside the drawer beneath the ledger. She looked out the kitchen window at the sweeping expanse of Rattlesnake Ridge. She had come to this unforgiving country broken, orphaned, and carrying a heavy heart in a body she had been taught to dislike. But the land had not judged her by her appearance or her grief. It had demanded only her patience, her labor, and her willingness to listen. In saving 50 discarded dying hives, she had inadvertently restored her family's forgotten heritage and rebuilt her own soul from the ground up. Abby stepped back out onto the porch, pulling her wool coat tightly around her shoulders as the morning sun broke over the eastern ridge, bathing the golden pastures in light. There was no sound now, except the soft, contented hum of 100 thriving colonies settling into a morning that belonged to them. There was no one left laughing, no point left to prove. The work was done, the circle was closed, and the good ground, as it always does when someone is patient enough to care for it, went on.